Dropping a motorcycle is one of the most common causes of damage to a motorcycle. Crashes get all the headlines, but drops occur most frequently and are often not talked about. A drop at the wrong time is not only costly, but can be embarrassing as well. A lot of drops occur because riders don't understand or practice a few simple techniques that can make dropping your motorcycle less frequent or eliminate them altogether. This week on MC Rider, let's look at some tips to eliminate drops and some slow speed riding techniques that keep you out of this embarrassing situation. So what common mistake did our rider make when he dropped his motorcycle? When a motorcycle gets away from you, there's a moment in time where it's a point of no return. At some point, the motorcycle has leaned too far to save it. Let's pause the video and look at this rider's point of no return. At this frame, the motorcycle is stopped, but look where the handlebars are pointed. That's right, to the right. So tip number one is making sure the handlebars are square or straight before coming to a stop. If the handlebars are turned, the motorcycle will naturally want to fall or lean to that side. If you're on a heavy motorcycle, there's a certain point where you're not going to be able to save it. All you can do at that point is get out of the way. Getting the handlebars straight can be a little tricky when turning into a tight parking space, but requires some foreplanning on the part of the rider. But remember, at slow speeds, straighten the handlebars before you go to the brakes. Brings us to tip number two, is to use the rear brake only during slow speed maneuvering. So when turning into that tight spot, use only the rear brake. If you add the front brake to having the handlebars turned, you will almost always drop the motorcycle. So for slow speed maneuvers, use the rear brake only on a motorcycle when coming to a stop while making sure the handlebars are square. Tip number three is get familiar with the friction zone on your motorcycle. Many riders don't understand or even use the friction zone, and this often leads to drops because they're trying to control the speed of the motorcycle with only the brakes and or the throttle. Your clutch at slow speeds is your friend. So what is the friction zone on a motorcycle? If I reach out with that clutch hand and I fully squeeze in the clutch handle, I've removed all power from that rear wheel. Fully releasing it, I'm giving it full power to the rear wheel. But if I squeeze that clutch in and I slowly begin to release the clutch, at some point I'm going to have partial power to that rear wheel. That partial power is what we call the friction zone, and it helps us control the speed of the motorcycle, particularly when we're doing slow speed maneuvers. My Goldwing behind me is a DCT model, and it does not have a clutch lever, but it still has a clutch. It's just that the motorcycle controls it by using minimal throttle and the rear brake to help control the speed. The motorcycle will still slip the clutch, giving you slow speed control, just like it would if the clutch was in the friction zone. The technique for riders on a scooter would be the same as the Goldwing with the DCT, rear brake, and smooth, easy throttle to help control the speed of the motorcycle. Tip number four is head and eye placement. Where a rider is looking has a big impact on their balance and their ability to keep their balance at slow speeds. Keep your head and eyes up in the direction of where you want to go. Too many riders at slow speed look down, and it throws your balance off because you don't have that horizon to help you keep your balance. So keep those head and eyes up, looking in the direction you want to go. So if I'm making a left-hand turn, I'm looking in the direction I want to go. If I'm going straight ahead, I'm looking out into the distance, the direction I want the motorcycle to go. Tip number five is secure your ground game. There's a lot of stuff that's in here, but things like make sure your kickstand's down when you're getting off the motorcycle. Make sure it's up when you leave. Make sure your shoes or boots have good traction for the pavement. If possible, avoid gravel or other loose surfaces where you're going to be placing your plant foot when you come to a stop. Loose pant legs or loose shoestrings can all cause problems if they get hung on the control of a motorcycle. One of the most common areas where riders struggle when they're taking the basic rider course is with slow speed maneuvers. The dreaded U-turn has caused sleepless nights for more than one rider who is working to get their license. Well, like a lot of things in life, there's some good news and some bad news. And here's the bad news. If you struggled with the U-turn on a small training motorcycle, it will be more difficult when you get on a larger motorcycle. The small mistakes you make on a small bike are magnified when you're on a larger bike. If you get a little out of balance on a small motorcycle and you're able to muscle it back to straight, you're likely to drop a larger motorcycle in the same exact situation. But here's the good news. The technique for U-turns and slow speed riding is exactly the same on a large motorcycle as it is on a small motorcycle. The key word here is technique. So here's some techniques to slow speed motorcycle handling. Head and eyes. Looking and pointing your head and eyes where you want the motorcycle to go. As we talked earlier, clutch in the friction zone. Dragging the rear brake, so light pressure on the rear brake. And counterweighting if making a turn. So if I'm turning to the left, I'm leaning or I'm counterweighting a little to the right to help counterbalance that weight. Those techniques work on a small bike and they work just the same on a larger motorcycle. Problems often occur because riders are able to cheat the technique on a small motorcycle. Smaller motorcycles are easier to handle, but that same rider gets on a large motorcycle and suddenly they realize they can't handle it the way they did the smaller training motorcycle, and it's because they're not riding with the proper technique. Where they could cheat on the small motorcycle, it does not work on a larger, heavier bike. Technique is key. So using the proper technique, as mentioned earlier, here are some simple exercises that you can work on to improve your slow speed riding and hopefully avoid those embarrassing drops no matter what size the motorcycle that you're riding. So here's an exercise you'll frequently hear called the slow race. And our goal is not to necessarily ride as slow as we possibly can. I'm riding at a nice even walking pace. But our goal really when you're starting out on this is using proper technique. Look at my clutch hand. I'm keeping that clutch in the friction zone, keeping my head and eyes up, and I'm using a little bit of rear brake to help control the speed of the motorcycle. So I'll turn it around, I'll run it in the opposite direction. Again, our goal is not as slow as you possibly can. You want to shoot for about a walking pace eventually, but work on that technique. Not using the front brake at all. Head and eyes up, I'm looking across the parking lot. A little bit of rear brake, clutch in the friction zone. I'm riding at about a nice, easy walking pace. The second exercise we'll call the weave. I've got cones set 15 feet apart. If you need some training cones, go to mcrider.com/cones and you can order a set of these off of Amazon. But our technique is the same. I'm keeping my head and eyes up. I've got the clutch in the friction zone. I'm using a little bit of rear brake, not touching that front brake. Now I know that you could probably do this without using the clutch in the friction zone or the rear brake. But remember, we're working on correct technique, and our correct technique that we're trying to develop is slow speed skills. So when you get into more difficult skills, if you don't have that technique down, you're going to struggle. So we've got head and eyes up, clutch in the friction zone, using a little bit of rear brake, and I'm looking across the parking lot. I'm not looking down at the cones. I'm using my peripheral vision to see the cones. This third exercise we'll call the offset weave. I've got the same 7 cones that I had before. They're still 15 feet apart, But now, starting with the second cone and every other cone, I've offset it by about 3 feet. This causes the rider to have to weave a little bit more, but our technique's exactly the same. Head and eyes up, clutch in the friction zone, using a little bit of rear brake, not looking down at those cones, but looking across the parking lot. It helps using your peripheral vision when you're riding an exercise like this, so you're watching the cones in your peripheral vision, but you're keeping your head and eyes up. You're looking across that parking lot. That's an important skill to work on, and this is a good exercise to do it. The motorcycle is going to go where you look, so you want to keep your head and eyes up, not down. I hope you found these exercises helpful, working on your slow speed skills. If you did, I've got several others in the field guide that you can work on in an empty parking lot just like this, and I've got complete details to do that. Go to mcrider.com/support. And until next week, guys, this is Kevin with MC Rider, and we'll see you on the road. There are multiple ways to support the channel. You can become a member on YouTube at mcrider.com/member, or support the channel through Patreon at mcrider.com/support. Either way, you'll get full access to the forum and the field guides, which will further the training that we release here on a weekly basis.